Well, thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, sir. Welcome. It is 3 o'clock. I'm sure my mother will be astonished if I start on time. So, Mom, if you're watching, this is for you. But I'm really so grateful for everyone joining us here today. I'm here with my colleague, Kevin Mullen. Others will be joining in, as I'm sure you all know. It's a very, very busy day in Washington, and members are often double, triple booked. So I'm sure we will see people come in and out. But out of respect for your time, and so grateful to have you join us. Let's get started. And this conversation is really to talk about the major impact that artificial intelligence could have on our elections, and it's vitally important, and it couldn't be more timely. As I think we all know, with real clarity, we are 55 days from Election Day, but early voting is just about to begin. 10 days from now, we will be seeing military and overseas ballots being sent to our service members, and states are just about ready to begin mailing out absentee ballots, mail-in ballots, and certainly preparations are underway. We had 6 secretaries of state testify in front of our standing committee this morning about the work they're doing in the run-up to what could be one of the most important elections in our nation's history. So the general election, as we like to say, is already here, and I think the conversation today spotlights a real challenge that we are now facing. I think one that's becoming clearer and clearer every day. And AI-generated content may be relatively new. I think it's certainly new in terms of how Americans see it, but it's actually been around for a long time. But I think what is new is it's now so accessible to people and so easily reached, and it's affordable, and you don't need a lot of expertise to be able to engage in it. It is as old as the idea of misinformation, disinformation. The tools are new, but the idea of misinformation, disinformation in elections is as old as elections are. And one of the things I was thinking of as a proud New Yorker and someone who was in New York City on 9/11, which we honor today, the memory of all the victims and the first responders and those military personnel who answered the call after it, that it demonstrates the power of rumors and conspiracy. Billions of people responded to the unimaginable tragedy of 9/11 with compassion, with great expressions of kindness and empathy for those in New York and other places that were attacked, those at the Pentagon. But some people, unable to grasp such an unimaginable horror, and some intentionally sowing hate and mistrust, chose fear over facts, and chose suspicion over sympathy. After the attacks, hateful conspiracies spread, tinged with racism, anti-Semitism, absolving Al-Qaeda of responsibility for this horrific tragedy. And the falsehoods persist today. A major component of this belief is QAnon, a group that believes that a deep state of politicians control the government, a group that just recently a former president of the United States amplified on social media. And it's not the only example of the dangerous rise in conspiracy theories and baseless claims. Lies about COVID contribute to hospitalization and deaths of thousands of people. Lies about the integrity of American elections, denial still, even as recent as last night by the former president. But Those denials led to the attack here on the Capitol complex. So, our system of governance relies on the American people understanding a common set of facts. Bad actors, both intentionally and unwittingly, have eroded this collective truth, and we are now faced with the potential threat to that collective truth, artificial intelligence. And for all the amazing, miraculous things it can do, we do face, however, the dark side where provocateurs, politicians, foreign adversaries can quickly and cheaply create convincingly authentic material to manipulate audiences like potential voters and spread false information about the security of our elections. I don't know how many of you saw this yesterday. New York Times Digital, it was yesterday, the day before, had several examples of videos, and you were sort of asked, because everything's a game and you take quizzes, to identify which of those were artificial intelligence, AI generated, which were real film or made without the use of AI. I took it. It is nearly impossible. And to the extent that I was right on any of them, I think it was just purely a guess, because the images are it's extraordinary. And all of this, as it relates to our politics and AI, is not speculative. In Michigan, Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice was utilized to endorse a candidate for Congress, rather shockingly. New Hampshire, we all know about the president's voice being generated to encourage folks not to participate in the presidential primary in that state. Foreign adversaries have spread falsehoods about political candidates and parties to undermine our government and society. Last week, the Department of Justice unsealed indictments against Russian employees, the Kremlin-backed media outlet RT, which is, I believe, the original name was Russia Today. So I don't know if that leaves any questions about what they're part of, but part of the Russian government's effort to interfere in our elections. But some folks choose inaction. The FCC and FEC have both attempted to create rules on the use of AI in elections, which is not only well within their jurisdictions, but is also necessary to preserve the security of our elections. So sadly, many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have chosen to block or criticize this necessary action, which I find literally mind-bending. For example, Senator Mike Lee introduced a bill to end FCC meddling in our elections. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that. The FEC's outstanding petition for rulemaking has been repeatedly delayed. The FCC's proposed rule requiring disclosures on the use of AI political advertisements has been criticized by some who say that it would cause chaos. Only in an Orwellian world would that be the concern. I believe the true chaos will be caused by an election where these technologies remain completely unregulated as it relates to political advertising. And what happens, the public remains unprotected and sadly, potentially uninformed. So those working to stymie new regulations do not represent the best interests of the American people or our government. Instead, they do so for their own gain. When it comes to protecting our elections, our democracy, inaction is an invitation to misconduct. Inaction emboldens our foreign adversaries and the ill-intended forces gathering to sow confusion and chaos. So for that reason, we've gathered all of you together. I want to thank FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel for being here, before your extraordinary work. Vice Chair of the FEC, Ellen Weintraub, for your great work, and Professor Overton for recognizing the urgency of regulating AI in political communications. I'm delighted to have you all here and grateful for your participating in this conversation. I acknowledged my colleague Kevin Mullen when we began. I also want to acknowledge my dear friend Derek Kilmer, who has been working on modernizing Congress and has been a great voice. Of course, Doris Matsui, who's been a longtime activist in this space. We're also joined by Valerie Foushee from North Carolina, who's in her first term, but nearing the end of her first term. So you'll no longer be a freshman. Kevin is also a first term. And of course, Bill Foster, who has many distinctions. One is being, I think, still the only physicist in the House of Representatives. So we pay a lot of attention to what Mr. Foster says, but grateful that you're all here. And before that, let me briefly introduce our panelists and ask them to say some comments, and then we'll open it up to a conversation by all of us. So it's my pleasure to introduce the three leaders. As I said, Jessica Rosenworcel, the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, a true advocate for connectivity and digital opportunity. Vice Chair Ellen Weintraub, who's been a steadfast advocate for transparency and accountability in our elections to the FEC, and I'm so grateful for all the work they've done for over 2 decades. And finally, Spencer Overton, who's the Patricia Roberts Harris Research Professor at George Washington University Law School. That is a mouthful, but Professor Overton is a leading expert on democracy, race, and voter suppression, has been instrumental in shaping the modern election law and policy. We're honored to have you all here, and I'm going to ask you if you might just help set the sort of level set for us, Professor, to just talk about the significant risks that AI pose to the election. So the floor is yours, and then I'm going to turn it over to the chair and then the vice chair to address their efforts to deal with both of these issues. So thank you again, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, members. Thanks so much for having me here today. My major point today is that no one regulation is going to solve all the challenges that we face. Certainly not everything I mentioned today, right? But we have to start somewhere, and we need federal agencies like the FCC and the FEC to step up to the plate and start regulating in this area. Requiring disclosure of AI-created content and political ads is an important first step. If we can't do that, we've got no shot at grappling with the magnitude of challenges that are in front of us. So now I want to start off by emphasizing what's different about generative AI. Advances in natural language processing, that's like a computer's ability to so-called understand text and spoken words. That enables individual kind of lone wolf trolls to quickly develop large volumes of synthetic text, video, audio, code. So you no longer need to be a super PAC with millions of dollars or the Russian government to cause real problems. Instead, you can be a 23-year-old unemployed young male living in his parents' basement in Idaho who wants to spread chaos among voters in Raleigh, Durham area here. Race is a more significant factor in voting patterns than gender, class, education, other demographic factors. And if you can deceive voters along racial lines, you can change election outcomes. So for example, we saw the Russians do this in 2016 in terms of pretending to be Black Americans and saying, hey, let's not go out and vote here. 38% of the ads purchased by Russians were targeted at Black Americans. Deepfake technology will only supercharge these deceptive practices. Generative AI allows for even more precise micro-targeting. Rather than produce one ad focused on 100,000 Latino voters, it's easier to produce 20 different ads for 5,000 different Latino groups that are more persuasive because they're customized. Also, many large language models are good in terms of translation. That can be a great thing, right? The problem is that bad actors can more easily create political ads in Spanish, various Asian languages, and tribal languages with disinformation and misinformation that are difficult to connect to detect here, right? Deepfake technologies will also be used by white supremacists to tap into and increase cultural anxiety and racial animosity. Expect deepfake technology to be used to spread lies about massive voter fraud in communities of color, or the need to challenge voters in communities of color. I also want to flag that AI could make it easier to facilitate attacks on county election offices that serve large numbers of people of color. So I'm talking about thousands of unsubstantiated voter challenges, a nuisance open record requests, phishing schemes that allow for cyber attacks targeted at these areas. These attacks could divert resources and increase vote wait times and make voting more difficult. Currently, people of color make up a majority of the population in about 400 counties across the United States. An AI-powered attack on a handful of county election offices that serve Detroit, Charlotte, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, or even just a handful of election offices in the Black rural South or rural Arizona could potentially shift the outcome of a presidential election. You could also imagine AI facilitating harassment and threats against election workers like Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, and deep fake video created to make it look like they're stuffing ballot boxes here, right? So we need federal agencies to get started on just straightforward regulations like requiring disclosure for political ads, because really that should be the low-hanging fruit. Like, if we don't deal with that, we're not going to deal with all these other challenges. Big tech, they've got a lack of economic incentives, and they lack the political and civil rights competencies for us to just sit back and expect them to deal with these challenges. So for more on these issues, I urge you to read my law review article, Overcoming Racial Harm for Democracy from AI.
Terrific. Thank you, Professor, for all of the work that you've done in this space. Thank you for those comments. And before I call on Chairwoman Rosenworcel, I want to acknowledge my buddy Darren Soto from the state of Florida, Representative Hillary Skolton from Michigan, and Representative Frank Pallone, soon to be Chairman Pallone, from New Jersey. So welcome all. And just colleagues were asked a professor to do an overview. I'm going to ask the chair talk about the great work FCC is doing despite pushback, and then the vice chair of the FEC to talk about the work that they're doing. So, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you, Congressman Morelle, and to all the members who are here. I'm really glad that we can have this discussion. It's also a treat to be between these two dynamos who do a lot of work on democracy and voting, and it's really important work. I'm grateful for it. So we're here because we understand that AI has now become powerful enough to mimic human voices and create lifelike images. And this year, in the primary election in New Hampshire, thousands of voters got an AI-generated robocall impersonating President Biden, telling them not to vote. And this past summer, the campaign of Governor DeSantis was flagged for circulating AI-altered images of former President Trump. Bring that up because it can happen on all sides.
Yeah.
Now, facing a rising tide of disinformation, surveys show that 3/4 of the people in this country say they're concerned about misleading AI-generated content. It's a lot. So at the FCC, we're looking at this looming threat, and we've organized our work around one simple standard that's grounded in a basic principle of democracy, and that's just transparency. We've proposed that political advertisements that run on television and radio should disclose AI if it is being used. They should be transparent. If a candidate or issue campaign has used AI to create an ad, we think the public has a right to know. Voters deserve to know if the voices and images in political commercials are authentic or if they've been manipulated. To be clear, we are not making judgment on the content being shared or preventing it from being airing. This is not about telling the public what's true and what's false. It's about empowering every voter, viewer, and listener to make their own decisions. Now, there are some people out there, including some folks you work with, who dispute the power granted by Congress to the FCC to oversee the political messages that we see on television, hear over the radio, or even receive over the phone through robocalls. Those people are wrong. Since the 1930s, the FCC has used its authority under the law to require our nation's broadcasters to maintain a publicly available file of all campaign ads, everything they air. And this file has information about who bought a campaign ad, how much they paid for it, and when it ran. Now, over time, Congress has updated those requirements to include ads run on cable and satellite too. And these are the policies that have led to what is probably now very familiar to all of us, those on-air disclosures that every viewer and listener knows who is responsible for the contents of an ad. So while obfuscating and hand-wringing about authority sometimes works in Washington, states across the country are not waiting. Nearly half the states have enacted laws to regulate the use of AI technology in elections. And by the way, most of those laws are bipartisan. And while those actions may not cover all aspects of how this technology may or may not be used in our elections, I think what the states are getting is the urgency of this moment we're in. And just what the professor said a moment ago, we need to start somewhere. Now, I think we can help bring uniformity and stability to this patchwork of state laws and AI technology and deepfakes by just committing to this principle of transparency in political advertising. Now, I understand the FEC is also considering a rulemaking on AI, the more the merrier. But with our complementary authorities, the FEC can regulate AI use in online advertisements for federal candidates, while the FCC can focus on the areas where the FEC does not have power to act. For instance, the FEC does not oversee television or radio stations, and moreover, under the law, the FEC authority over campaigns is limited to federal political candidates. It doesn't extend to independent issue campaigns or state and local elections. The FCC's authority does. So we can address those loopholes. Now, I think we can be multi-jurisdictional and bipartisan when we do this. And the reason I think that is because we've already done it. 1 month after that New Hampshire call came in with that voice cloned President Biden, the FCC in a bipartisan vote unanimously adopted a rule saying that robocalls using AI-generated voices violated the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Next, I joined forces with the New Hampshire's Republican Attorney General in a bipartisan effort to track down the guy who sent those calls. We fined that individual $6 million, and the AG is now pursuing criminal prosecution. So I think we can follow that kind of cooperative model here and help secure our elections from bad actors by setting a disclosure standard that's going to help stop those who want to abuse this technology to misinform voters. There's just too much potential for AI to manipulate voices and images in political advertising to do nothing. So I think the place to start is focusing on transparency and trust. And the FCC recently started a rulemaking proposing these policies. It's a rulemaking I look forward to bringing to completion. And I want to thank you all for being here for this discussion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair of the FEC, Ellen Weintraub, who's been leading in this effort. And as everyone knows, the FEC has both equal numbers of members on both sides, which makes certain things frustrating to accomplish. But thanks for being here, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Morelle, and thank you to all of the members. It's so great to see so much interest in this topic, and I'm honored to be on this panel. I feel like I am definitely in the right room today. The FEC, as you mentioned, is a bipartisan 6-member body where I currently serve as vice chair. The views I express here today are solely my own. The FEC's mission is to protect the integrity of the federal campaign finance system, providing transparency to ensure a well-informed electorate. It is at its core. The threat to that informed electorate from digital disinformation has been a long-standing concern of mine. I convened a symposium on this topic at the FEC in 2019 in advance of the last presidential election. But now, in AI, we face a new tool that has the power to supercharge the threats to truth, trust, and transparency in our elections. The risk of a deepfake October surprise has animated the public debate on AI in elections, but there are more subtle risks as well, such as the risk of AI-enhanced micro-targeting, spreading disinformation at warp speed, screened from the corrective of counterspeech. And all this happens at a time when our intelligence community warns of continued risks of malign foreign influence campaigns intended to, quote, undermine public confidence in the security and integrity of the American elections process and exacerbate partisan tensions, end quote. Americans deserve to know whether what they are seeing online is real. On July 13, 2023, Public Citizen filed a rulemaking petition asking the FEC to address the use of AI in campaign advertisements. The commission received over 2,400 comments in response. Overwhelmingly, the commenters encouraged the commission to act. One comment was filed by 31 members of Congress, urging the FEC to, quote, regulate the use of generative AI in campaign advertisements and protect the democratic processes that serve our country, end quote. The Nonpartisan Center for Democracy and Technology cautioned that, quote, public faith in the electoral process itself may be at stake. Recent polling shows that 85% of Americans are concerned about the spread of misleading video and audio deepfakes. So they found a survey that was even more scary than yours. I support the rulemaking petition and appreciate the interest of the public and the insights of the many commenters. Our jurisdiction in this area is limited, but it is not non-existent. The petition is based on 52 U.S. Code 3124, which says that a candidate shall not fraudulently misrepresent himself as speaking, writing, or acting on behalf of another candidate or party in a way that is damaging to that candidate or party. And moreover, under the statute, no person shall fraudulently misrepresent himself as speaking, writing, or acting on behalf of any candidate or political party for the purposes of soliciting contributions or donations. So outside of the solicitation context, this provision basically covers fraud by one candidate or his employees or agents against another candidate or party. It doesn't cover super PACs or other outside spending groups. It doesn't cover AI-generated false images that do not misrepresent or purport to act on behalf of a candidate or party, but rather, for example, show fabricated video of a fire or a riot at a polling station to suppress the vote. In order to more broadly regulate AI-generated political advertising, the FEC would have to be given expanded authority, as some of our legislative recommendations, which we always issue on a unanimous bipartisan basis, have suggested. So what can the FEC do? I believe the FEC does have the authority to conduct a narrow rulemaking, but it is pretty clear, more than a year after the petition was filed, that the FEC is not going to complete a rulemaking on AI before the 2024 election. The breaking news is that yesterday, 4 of my colleagues put forward a proposal to close the rulemaking, but at the same time to issue an interpretive rule that would make clear that fraudulent misrepresentation by means of AI is covered under our current statute and regulations. This proposal will be on the agenda of next week's open meeting. The interpretive rule could provide some immediate clarity, and I intend to support it. As a transparency advocate, I believe the first essential step in regulating AI in elections would be to require greater transparency when it is used. This was the most common suggestion in the comments the FEC received in response to the petition, and it is the most common provision in the 19 states that have already passed laws regulating political ads containing AI-generated content. This kind of transparency could be provided voluntarily by the platforms in the tech community, and I believe they have the responsibility to assist in managing the potential havoc they have unleashed with AI. But despite the good work going on in the states, I further believe this is an area that cries out for the uniformity that only federal legislation can provide. Legislation like the AI Transparency in Elections Act, introduced by Ranking Member Morelle. But without such specific direction from Congress, I do not foresee the FEC acting to require disclaimers specifically disclosing when AI is used in political ads. No one agency currently has the jurisdiction or capacity to address every aspect of the impact of AI on our political system. The FEC was created almost 50 years ago to address the problems of dirty tricks in politics. AI provides a high-tech accelerant to both intentional dirty tricks and the unintentional spread of conspiracy theories and lies. The threat of AI is real. Just ask Taylor Swift. To Ranking Member Morelle and my fellow panelists, I thank you for your continued leadership and voices on this issue, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. So I was just going to kick off with one quick question. I have many, but out of respect for our colleagues, if you have questions, raise your hand. I'll try to keep the list in order. So as they're thinking about questions or comments they want to make, you know, the question of disclosure versus prohibition of using generative AI is one that we weigh. The bill that you referenced, Madam Vice Chair, that I introduced deals with disclosure, which at first, when I was thinking about it, I was like, yeah, is this strong enough? This seems weak. But we ended up introducing it, figuring better than. And I wonder, Madam Chair, because you must have struggled with this as well when you're deciding what is it we're going to do. You came to your conclusion. Could you just walk us through how you weighed the various options? And then while you're doing that, folks, if you want to just, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. The First Amendment looms large in our work at the FCC, and recognizing that, we decided the best place to start was disclosure and transparency. We have a long history of doing that with different kinds of advertisements in the United States, and it is a simple place for us to start to understand the extent of use of this technology, what it means, and it puts decision in the hands of the viewer, listener, and voter. And we thought that was the right place to start, and it was legally sound.
Thank you. Mr. Mullen, and then Mr. Soto.
So thank you all for your leadership. Very informative. I come from the state of California. I was in the state legislature, authored the California Disclose Act, as well as the Social Media Disclose Act, hoping we can replicate that on the federal level. But had a conversation with the CEO of YouTube. YouTube is a company in my district, and the CEO was just talking about the challenges of detecting AI itself with all of the content sort of coming through the big pipe into that company and then out onto social media. So I guess basic questions around sort of where the burden lies, kind of where the technology is and being able to detect AI, where that responsibility lies, kind of where that technology is on detection. And then just anything you have on digital ads and social media, which, you know, is this kind of amalgam hybrid, not sure really who has that tech oversight and just how you grapple with sort of, you know, there's the traditional TV, but so much of the stuff is moving in the digital space and how you sort of grapple with it.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay. So some studies have shown significant racial disparities in terms of deepfake detection. So they're more accurate on lighter skin than with darker skin. So we have to get better in terms of just the technology with regard to deepfake detection, right? So that's point one. Point two, in terms of these companies, you know, there's some significant companies like Google and Meta that have significant civil rights infrastructure. And the question is that infrastructure being applied in terms of just old products like Instagram or kind of new technologies? I think a lot of these companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, started up with a lot of money. They didn't start up in a garage, and there's really no reason they shouldn't have significant infrastructure in terms of civil rights, you know, the way that Meta does already in terms of the social media piece to deal with that. Finally, I just want to say, I think something we got to just be honest about and look out for is there has been, unfortunately, a real partisan divide in terms of the social media piece. You know, we see that in terms of the legislation in Texas and Florida, et cetera. I'm so concerned about that coming over into the kind of fight against woke AI and, you know, all of that debate. So the question is, how quickly can we move and how can we figure out how to hold back on that kind of partisan divide in this kind of AI regulation space that we see in the social media context?
Yeah, but your question goes, and then I'm going to go to Darren, Ms. Matsui, Mr. Foster, and then Ms. Golden. But it's also about the technology being available to detect, right? I know there's a lot of work being done about watermarks. I mean, that sort of goes also to your question.
Trying to catch up.
Yeah, because you're going to end up, even if we got the FEC and we've already generated, it's both altered or generated by, right? So I mean, that's part of the dilemma here. There is no test.
I do think it requires an all of society approach. And I think, as I said, that the technology companies, they've got to own some responsibility here because, you know, don't take my word for it. Listen to Jeffrey Hinton, who was the godfather of AI.
Yeah.
And you know, he left Google because he was concerned about what they were doing. And I think a lot of these companies rushed out with this technology as soon as one person opened the door. Then they all figured they had to get into the act because they didn't want to lose market share. And I don't think that they took sufficient time to consider the consequences, the potential consequences. So I think that they do have a responsibility. I mean, they are better positioned, certainly, than my agency in detecting that sort of generative AI. We in the digital space, we do have some jurisdiction over advertising that specifically solicits money, that engages in express advocacy, which, as you know, is a pretty narrow standard, or is coming from political committees. That kind of paid advertising, we can require disclosures of who's paying for it. But we don't have any statutory hook right now that would there certainly isn't a consensus on the commission that we could get this far under our current statutory authority for requiring a disclaimer that would say, and this is generated by AI, not just who is paying for the ad, but what is in the ad. And that's where I think we just, whether we could make an argument that we ought to be able to find that jurisdiction, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't find support for it. So we're just going to need statutory help on that.
Yeah, we oversee broadcasters, so that's television and radio, traditional. But because we license them, if they fail to do this well, we have enforcement authority to go after them. So there is a burden on them to engage in that kind of fact finding and make sure those filings are accurate. I think that tool is powerful. And while it is limited because we don't get to the digital advertisements, what I hope is that if I can get the FCC to do this, it's a norm changing environment where as a viewer, listener, and voter, you expect to see some kind of disclosure at the end, some kind of acknowledgement. And when you don't see that on the equivalent digital ad, you might pause.
Well, there's one way to get at it, but you're right, that there's much greater exposure to a broadcast company than there is to a platform, obviously. Mr. Soto.
Thanks. Well, those of us on the Energy and Commerce Committee share your frustration, right? When we had Frank here and the bills that have stacked up, whether it's privacy, social media regulation, and I do share your concern, Professor Overton. By the way, GW Law, you make us proud. That it could get in that partisan divide. We saw our very own privacy bill have to get pulled because the chairwoman had a conflict with the speaker over it at the time. But eventually, presumably, we'll get these things done eventually. The other point I want to make, and then I'm going to ask you about where the specific gaps you think we need to plug in your jurisdiction are. At least my constituents and others, it's not like 2016 anymore where people just are totally surprised that there's deep fakes out there and that there's foreign influence. So I do think there's a little more savviness. So disclosures go a long way when people know, oh, well, duh, we know this stuff goes. So I think American voters are more mature to these things now, and that helps us. But my question is that, what do you think are still the specific gaps in your authority right now for enforcement in areas of AI and elections, well, AI and communications? And I also love to hear your perspective on it too, Professor Overton. But Chairwoman first.
Yeah, first things first, online and digital. It's the Wild West.
Yeah.
Things move fast,
So
and they don't have to be credible. We don't oversee that.
So would the privacy law give you that authority then?
I'd have to look
Okay.
and check on that.
Yeah, because it would have to affirmatively extend
Yeah.
your authority to those.
Yeah, as a general
Is it
matter, we
FTC
will
that
deal
does
with the
that?
network element of the internet, but not the content. And as more of us start watching online and more of us get our news and information online, I think this gets more perilous because that's where it's cheapest and easiest to distribute it.
And our ranking member reminded me the FTC plays a big role in this too, who obviously we don't have here right now.
Just
Professor.
very quickly.
Where are the gaps that we need to fix?
Yeah. I think it's kind of a whole of government in terms of various agencies are relevant and could be playing in terms of this. Happy to follow up in terms of more specifics afterward. I would say, to the extent that there is a moment where the stars align and different actors in the executive branch and the Senate and the House can do something, I think being prepared for those moments to move quickly is really important. So people thinking about this in advance, because when you have the window, it's not really the time for discussion and debate. It's really the time to move.
Well, we've been waiting 5.5 years, if I'm being honest, between last two terms and this term. So we're ready when we get the opportunity.
Ms. Matsui or Mr. Foster?
Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And you too, Professor. It seems to me there's a clear and present danger right now, particularly with the elections coming up. It's interesting because Darren and I were just meeting with Secretary Raimondo and just about things like this AI, but also more about business and things. But then we got into how the impact stretches across with training and education. And then we talked about watermarks and all of this and realizing, of course, that it's everything, as you were saying too. But what's really necessary, I think that this is something that's come up, Frank and I wrote a letter to FCC regarding about transparency and all of that too. And we know that that's really very important. We also know that the states are doing things already. We know that also too, because I think what the legislature has done already is passed something about transparency in, I guess, on the advertisements and political ads when they use generative AI. And I think that's on the governor's desk. And also the deceptive deep fakes too. Those are pieces of it. California, as you know, just we do these things, right?
Yes.
In a sense to say, hey, we're going to do this, right? And sometimes they don't, they clash. On the other hand, a lot of this is, a big state. A lot of this is happening, much like in Florida. And so we're doing this. But what I'm wondering about is that, having a whole of government approach is really good, because we know. And we even talked about interagency type meetings and things like that, as we've done national security and all that. But sometimes I think when they get too big, it becomes very difficult, because you do need some experts in there. You need the legal aspects of it. You need the people who understand the technology, but you also need how it impacts regular people. And to have some sort of committee or something like that that has, overseen by someone with authority, I think is really going to be very important. We believe that as we said, the administration start off, and I think they have an executive order, do they not, right? And then let's start this process, right? Because we've got to start somewhere. And if we don't start, we'll be behind again, right? And we're hopeful for a change in administration, but you know how that goes, because it takes a while, right? And we thought it'd be great if certain committees that are all engaged in this anyway, even have within their subcommittees or wherever, because we have technology and communications and all that, which you're a part of. If we have some interesting meetings across, administration, the committees, it would be helpful, because we really do need to have a baseline understanding. Because what's happening now, we are all getting a lot of information, but there are different levels of information. And I really think that there's some of us who really have to do this because of the committee jurisdiction, that we really need to have more of an interaction to know what can happen if we do certain things. I mean, we're already here. And, I'm really glad, Joe, for your doing this, because it is hitting we see it happening right now already in the political sphere. And we've seen it happening before, and it was something without some of the intense digital and AI. Now it's all over. So we really feel that it's time now, and people are really talking about regulation, because we have to do something. And to do regulation, we want to do it as good as possible, right? And without some unintended consequences. But I think we can't wait. And I think most people believe that now.
Mr. Foster?
So identity fraud and inauthentic speech is at the heart of a lot of the abuses that are going on. And I think that if you look at all the ways that we failed to do things like the failure to pass a privacy bill, all this sort of stuff, it was in large part because none of this stuff works without a secure digital identity. The ability to prove you are who you say you are online in a non-refutable way. So when a robocall, someone can send me a robocall, and if they're not willing to digitally sign it to prove they're a legally traceable person, I'm just going to dump it or send an email. If it's not signed by a legally traceable person, I'll put it in my spam filter, right? And so the problem is, the administration came in, at the very start of the administration with their cybersecurity strategy, and then their cybersecurity implementation plan. And then the strategy mentioned we're going to have to deal with a secure digital ID for citizens who want one. And then it got dropped in the implementation plan. And now we've been promised that it is imminent, that there be a executive order on identity fraud and digital ID. We've seen, tens of billions of dollars of identity fraud during COVID was stolen from the taxpayer, and all these sort of things. You cannot do privacy, for example, is one of the fundamental rights, and privacy is you have to be able to go to a company and say, tell me the information you're holding on me. And then the immediate question is, who the hell are you? And how do we know that you're not some fraudster impersonating the person to steal the information? The only answer to that is what's being pursued by the European Union, Estonia, large number of countries. They have provided citizens who want with a tool to prove they are who they say they are, not only in person like a TSA, but in an online environment. The tool at hand for that is the NIST standard mobile ID, digital driver's license. And states are in, like 25 states have now got digital driver's licenses in the pipeline or implemented. Soon we're going to be able to just go through TSA, using a phone's ability to recognize its owner. So all of these things were developed by NIST back in the Obama administration. They were promised by this administration, and nothing's been delivered. Do you have any insight in when we're finally going to get the ability to, because when citizens have that ability, then we can do privacy. And until then, we cannot do privacy. We cannot prevent fraudulent speech. Everyone's worried about deepfake impersonation. And, in reality, one of the biggest threats to your privacy is having someone impersonate you online. And that stops only when you have the ability to digitally sign some electronic communication, say, this is really me, and it is me, and I've just signed on to done the biometric ID with my phone, signed on to my digital driver's license so that it's not someone impersonating me. That technology, like I say, it's existed. And do you have any insight into when we're finally going to see that executive order on secure digital identity?
Not in our jurisdiction, so no, sorry.
No insight, no, okay. Because that's the key. We're never going to do privacy without the ability to prove you are who you say you are. We're never going to solve, all of the robocall, fraudulent robocall problem. Someone could send me a digital ad, but if it's not signed by the campaign with a legally traceable person on the end of it, I will just assume, I will program my software to just say it's all robot generated crap. That's the only way that's going to work.
So Bill, if you're a campaign and you have a AI generated ad, you might, as the responsible party of the campaign, if you had a digital signature, be able to communicate with the FCC or to in this case, probably be a network or a local broadcast media, that you are who you are. But it doesn't help them determine whether or not the ad itself, right, unless I'm misunderstanding, has been generated with or has used generative AI in its.
Right, but at least you'll know who's responsible for the fraud. You're not going to be in a situation where you have to track down this fake robocall and partner with whoever you had to partner with. It should be obvious to the software on your phone, this is an unsigned robocall coming in, should I just dump it? And you will, the world, I don't think we're going to prevent the internet from being turned into a flood of AI generated trash. It's just going to happen. The best we can do is to provide people with tools to filter out what's authentic communication, digitally signed by someone who will stand behind that communication. And we're going to have to assume everything else is crap. I don't think there's any, if you look at your spam filter, if you don't believe me, it's, I think members of Congress are all subject to really interesting, very sophisticated phishing attempts where someone is researched by your children, to make emails that look like they're from your kids, for example.
And your voices are all in the public domain.
Right, they
When it
sure
comes
are.
to the
For
robocall
sure.
potential,
Yeah.
that's cheap and easy. And I know we're talking about advertisements here, but in the few weeks running up to the elections,
Mhm.
I think what we just saw in New Hampshire is
Yeah.
just the
Yeah.
start.
Yeah.
No question.
Well, that's why if the administration had done this from the start, when on the time scale they promised, we'd have those tools in hand to know when the robocall was fake. And so we're not going to make it by
So
this
I
election.
do want to just acknowledge that we have StirShaken technology, which is an authentication tool on our phone system right now, which helps do exactly what you
Little
said.
bit, yeah.
But the problem is ultimately the entire network is not IP. So you have these analog portions where you lose that intelligence.
Yeah, which is where the fraudsters come in.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Before I go to Hillary, the point is well taken. I had someone show me a video of me saying that the Chicago Cubs are the greatest team in sports history, and I'm a diehard
You know
St.
it's
Louis
the White
Cardinals. I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan, so all due respect to my Illinois colleagues, that I would never have uttered those words.
Thank you all so much for being here. I wanted to just go back to this, the idea of prohibition versus disclosure. It strikes me, does it have to be a binary choice, right? Not all free speech is protected, right? Similarly, there could be different categories, right? Of certain AI is prohibited. Others, if you're using it, you have to put a disclaimer on it. What are the problems or potential pitfalls there? I always hear people talking about it as this binary choice, but it's always struck me that it doesn't have to be that way.
Well, that's fair. I mean, listen, libel and slander, there are consequences for that. That's
Right.
free speech too. So you're absolutely right when we talk about it like a binary system. That is a little bit simplifying.
Yeah.
I guess what I would say is that if you want me running the FCC deciding what's real, what's fake, cool, I trust my judgment too, right?
Yeah.
But you got to be really comfortable with the Trump's head of the FCC doing that too.
Yeah.
And I think what it comes down to is that in a principled way where we honor the First Amendment, I'm nervous about giving that authority to federal actors.
I would think it would be, something we as legislators, would have to come up with, and likely over time, this would be parsed out.
And
through the
if we
courts.
start with disclosure over
Yeah.
time, I think we might actually start to identify exactly what you need to do to legislate. In other words, finding some classes of behavior that are beyond the pale and legally susceptible, and we might actually be able to do that more credibly.
But that would be almost, if I understand it, would almost be, I'll yield to you, Professor, but almost as though it's a hierarchy. So almost everything that uses generative AI or altered images should be at least disclosed, right?
Yeah.
And then
right.
to the degree that there are other acts that go in increasing danger to the public, I think you're right, Congress would have to do it rather than relying on rulemaking. I mean, we'd have to affirmatively do it, but that's how I would see. It's like step-ups based on the degree, but it's hard to figure out which would be prohibited activity, but Professor O.
Just quickly, one, disclosure, first step. Gotta go ahead and do it, right? Constitutional standpoint, everything is first step, right? Now, there are some areas where at least past Supreme Courts, I don't know what this Supreme Court is gonna do, they have carved out, and they basically said, we could possibly regulate and restrict. So for example, you can't say Hillary Clinton, you can't restrict Hillary Clinton doesn't like black people. That's free speech, right? But you can restrict, hey, voting is on Wednesday and not Tuesday.
Right.
Congress
Right.
can prevent misleading about time, place, and manner of regulations.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing we could definitely restrict, or you all could, right?
But you could, if Hillary Clinton's image was altered, to have her say something that was derogatory towards black citizens, because
she
that's
could
her
say
image
it.
and likeness.
Yeah.
That actually could,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that could
I
be
think that
prohibited.
gets into the kind of the defamation
Right.
kind of libel
Right.
type.
Right.
And I completely agree with your premise that transparency is not going to solve all of the problems. You could have a nice little, and we do a lot of disclaimers. So that's something that we're very familiar with, is regulating disclaimers. And usually they're in, fine print at the bottom somewhere, and nobody ever reads them. I read them. I love disclaimers, but I always want to know who's paying for
The
it.
lawyers
Um,
among us too.
but-
Yeah.
One could easily imagine a very compelling video that even if some part of your brain recognizes, oh, there's something down there that says this isn't real, it could still have an impact.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I totally hear where you're coming from, but I do think that it just has to be the first step. We have to start there and then start developing the jurisprudence that opens the door to this. And then we see how far we can go.
And I'm not a politician here, but what is the political cost of people who oppose transparency and disclosure and don't want average Americans to know what's going on? It seems like, maybe there should be.
Right.
Well, you think, I mean,
You
it would
think.
seem, particularly in this era, that simple disclosure, which
Yeah.
doesn't, maybe not that simple, but if you saw an ad, whether it's digital or on television or on the radio, and the disclosure was generative AI was used in the production of this ad, that ought to send out, I mean, maybe not for everybody, but you think,
Right.
well, wait a second, what can I trust in this? That alone has the effect of, right, hopefully policing to some degree the behavior. That's why the disclosure
Well, I
is
think,
so
excuse
important.
me, I think the problem too is though that generative AI now has become embedded in a certain degree. I remember when it first came out, what was it like, maybe a year ago or so, that everybody thought about it and they didn't, now it's just like, it's there, right?
Yeah.
So that itself, I think isn't gonna be enough sometimes, because it's just, if, as time goes on, AI is,
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
it's more like software. It's
Yeah.
not like its own
Right.
sector of the economy. It is an implement that will be
Yeah.
used in everything we do. And the
Exactly.
sooner we embrace thinking about it like that, the more effective our policies will be.
Yeah, and I will say, and I'm gonna go to Mr. Foster in a second, but you may also have people who get content that they put in it that they don't even know is generated,
Yeah. Yes.
generative
Sure.
AI, which is where, when you get these sort of the multiplicity of it, which is why authentication
is.
ultimately, even to get to your point, Bill, that if you had this authentic handshake, you might not know the content. So it's really the watermarking ultimately, or the ability to determine whether it's been an altered image. But, that's the
Well,
far
you know,
beyond
at least
my.
know the person who's legally standing behind that.
Well,
if
you would.
they've been watered.
You would.
Because
No,
if we
that's
just say it's illegal to falsify video, it's like saying you can't make computer malware, right? Okay, you can make it illegal and it doesn't stop it, right? And so, but if you have a mandate to deliver the person legally standing behind it, that would make it a lot more.
But that's what NIST is doing now, right?
Yes.
Because we were talking with NIST today,
I
and,
think I mean, it's amazing. That executive
Yeah,
order
it's amazing.
is vast. It covers a lot.
Yeah, it does.
Mhm.
But I would actually argue to Congress, what we need to do now is be simple.
Yeah, I know.
Because
what
the
you mean.
public is not absorbing the
Yeah, we
complexity of
talked
what
about
NIST
being
is doing.
simple. I
you
mean,
know?
like, so we all understand it, the public understands it, because we can't explain it. If we can't explain it, then the public's not gonna understand it either.
And you have to make sure that whatever watermark or disclaimer is on a digital
Yeah.
communication is going to travel with it.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
things get
Well,
shared.
that's the whole
Yeah,
point of the
it's all gonna
watermark.
be
It's
in
gotta
the-
travel.
Exactly.
And I wanna certainly let folks have closing comments. I have 4 minutes remaining on this. So this is I don't never heard of a 4-minute warning, but anyway, it's a 4-minute warning.
Okay, a couple of you mentioned the problem with like micro targeting of messaging. What should the lines be there? Because, for example, if someone said, okay, you can get video of Trump being pro-choice and anti-pro-choice and pro-gun and anti-gun, all legitimate video, and then say, I'm going to deliver a subset of that based on who I'm delivering it to. That seems like we can do that with mail right now.
Yeah.
And it seems like that should be legitimate.
Yeah.
But where are the lines? Where does hyper targeting become dangerous?
So studies have shown that hyper targeting is not as effective here. It's not like if you go too detailed, right? What is very persuasive is bots that respond and immediately kind of manipulate people and understand where people are. So for good, they've had studies that show that bots can help people get rid of their conspiracy theories. So people who are conspiracy theorists, the bots work with like reality and but those same bots could be used for bad purposes. So I think the micro-targeting issue is a challenge and a problem, and I didn't get into it in terms of this 5-minute piece here, right? But I think the bot issue in terms of psychological manipulation of bots in terms of AI is an issue, and that's something we're going to have to figure out. I don't have what's the legislative solution, but that manipulation based on data that you have from folks is a significant concern in terms of psychological
And how does
manipulation.
that work with transparency? Are you going to have to publish every bot interaction with every citizen that they're talking to? That seems like a privacy invasion.
Yeah, I don't know what the exact solution is. And just also, and we got to wrap up, but this privacy issue is so connected to the AI piece, and it's so key here, right?
Yeah, no question. No question. Any other? Well, look, thank
It's
you.
probably not within 5 minutes, but if you have or could point us to, if there's an overview of like who is already tracking like who is influencing this, especially foreign players, like where we are keeping track of this. I know the DOJ and FBI are doing like minimal, and states, Michigan, obviously we have an incredible Secretary of State who is like doing everything she can to push it, but it just seems to me like we don't have a good framework for where some of this influence is coming from, and that's a really big scary piece.
Well, I talked to Jim Himes today about even the Intelligence Committee, the minority staff working with our folks on the House admin to start gathering those. So make sure we all know at least what
Yeah.
we know and what we don't know,
That's exactly
and the
it.
questions are, and sort of trying to
That's
make that.
exactly it.
And you all have had signs in,
I beg your pardon?
DHS, their office that deals with this, have you all had them there?
I've not, no,
Right.
no, that's
Yeah,
good to know.
the Jenny certainly, they do a lot of work thinking about elections,
Yeah,
get
no,
data
we,
gathering.
yeah, we have, that's really a
That's a good
good
one to
point,
do.
thank you for that.
But that's another thing,
ODNI.
with taking down these bot
Oh,
farms
DNI.
would be trivial with digital identity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's the thing, is these bot farms, rely on the fact that you don't have to digitally stand behind,
Yeah.
legally stand behind your, you don't have to know who the person is.
Right.
But you have to know if they do something illegal,
Right.
that they can be de-anonymized and
Yeah.
punished.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, thank you all,
Well, we'll
members, thank you for
let's
being
work
here,
on
this is an
that stuff.
important conversation, certainly thank you to our guests for your
That's so
hard work
key.
and for your
Right.
continued work, and we want to continue this conversation in the future, so thanks so much.
Thanks for your
Thank you.
leadership.
Take care, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.